number's too big to ignore, and I'm way too hungry to settle for chick food. Cause my stomach's starting to growl, and I'm going on the prowl for a Texas double whopper. Man, that's good. Oh yes, I'm a guy. I'll admit I've been fed quiche. Wait, tofu, bye-bye. Now it's the whopper beef I reach. I will eat this meat till my any turns into an Audi. I am starved. I am incorrigible. And I need to stuff a big burger, beef, bacon, jalapeno, good thing down.
Texas double whopper. Eat like a man.
Okay, so in Chapter 5, we'll look at communication and consumer behavior. But first, I want to ask you a question about the commercial that you just saw that harkens back to Chapter 4. And that is, at the risk of sounding like I'm trying to be comical, who is the target market for Burger King? And if you guessed young men, that's a really good guess. I shouldn't say guess because I know you know the answer. So I have a harder question, which is, what are the signifiers that you saw in that commercial? And you might say, wait, what is a signifier? What is semiotics? Well, it's part of the human communication process. So let's unpack that a little bit, and then I'll repitch my question to you. You see the model here, and the ultimate source of a marketing message is the organization that has information it wishes to share with others. However, within the context of an advertisement, a real or imaginary spokesperson actually lends voice or tone to the communication. Because the receiver's perception of the source influences the effectiveness of the communication, the spokesperson must appear to be knowledgeable, trustworthy, attractive, and relevant to the audience. The information contained in a message must be encoded so that the receiver understands what is being communicated. This involves using words or symbols that are familiar to the intended audience. Depending on the medium used, the message may be verbal or nonverbal. Semiotics is the study of how humans use words, gestures, signs, and symbols to convey feelings, thoughts, ideas, and ideologies. So back to the Burger King spot. How did they signify maleness? And you know what? I think I'll put a link in the discussion forum, and actually I'll include a link with probably a better iteration of that commercial. And perhaps you can kick that around, because hopefully you can see more than one signifier or symbol, if you prefer, of maleness. And that's a really, really important point for this chapter. One other important point is the channel in terms of definition. The channel is the means by which the encoded message travels from the source to the receiver. Communication channels can be categorized as personal or non-personal. Personal channels, such as personal selling, involve direct contact between the parties. On the other hand, non-personal channels of communication are those that rule out interpersonal contact between the sender and the receiver. Messages in commercial media, such as television, websites, magazines, radio, and billboards, are sent to many individuals at one time. Moving on, the receiver is usually the consumer who receives the advertiser's message. The advertiser must always be concerned about how the consumer will decode or interpret a message. Attitudes, perceptions, personalities, self-concept, and culture are just some of the many influences that affect the way people receive and respond to messages and how they behave as consumers. Complicating this problem is the fact that the sponsor's advertising message must compete with hundreds of other commercial and non-commercial messages every day. This is referred to as noise. So the sender doesn't know how the message is received, or even if it is received, unless a consumer acknowledges it. Feedback completes the cycle, verifying that the message was received. In the past, the consumer's feedback used different channels than the original message. But now, thanks again to technology, the audiences of advertising are no longer just passive receivers of impersonal mass messages. They are now active decision makers who can control what communications they receive and choose the information they want about a particular product. With interactive media, they can give instantaneous real-time feedback on the same channel used by the original message sender. In fact, in interactive media, consumers can be the source and advertisers the receiver, blurring the lines completely. Advertisers spend a lot of money to keep individuals and groups of individuals, markets, interested in their products. To succeed, they need to understand what makes potential customers behave the way they do. The advertiser's goal is to get enough relevant market data to develop accurate profiles of buyers, to find the common ground, or symbols, for communication. This involves the study of consumer behavior, the mental and emotional processes, and the physical activities of people who purchase and use goods and services to satisfy particular needs and wants. The moment we receive an advertising message, our mental computer runs a rapid evaluation called the consumer decision process. For simple, habitual, everyday purchases with low levels of involvement, the decision-making process is typically very abbreviated. But in those situations where we are highly involved in the purchase, it is not at all unusual for us to substantially extend the decision process. The three personal processes govern the way we discern raw data or stimuli and translate them into feelings, thoughts, feelings, and actions. The personal processes are the perception, the learning and persuasion, and the motivation processes. Our mental processes and behavior are affected by two sets of influences: interpersonal influences, which include our family, society, and culture, and non-personal influences, which are factors often outside the consumer's control, including time, place, and environment. These influences further affect the personal processes of perception, learning, and motivation. After dealing with these processes and influences, we face the pivotal question: to buy or not to buy. But taking that final step typically requires yet another process: the evaluation of alternatives, in which we choose brands, sizes, styles, and colors. If we do decide to buy, our post-purchase evaluation will influence our subsequent purchases. The term perception refers to the information received through the five senses. A stimulus is something, perhaps light, sound, or a scent, that we can perceive through our senses. It may originate within our bodies, as when we notice that we feel hungry at lunchtime. Or it may originate from outside our bodies, as when we see an ad for a smartphone and decide it looks beautiful. A second key element in perception is the personalized way of sensing and interpreting the stimulus data. Before any data can be perceived, they must first penetrate a set of perceptual screens, which are subconscious filters that shield us from unwanted messages. The physiological screens comprise the five senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. They detect incoming data and measure the dimension and intensity of the stimuli. When a stimulus is perceived, we try to make sense of it by relating it to the things we already know. This is the role of cognition, comprehending the stimulus. Information that passes through our perceptual screens affords us the opportunity to understand and accept it. Each consumer uses psychological screens to evaluate, filter, and personalize information according to subjective standards. These screens evaluate data based on the consumer's personality, unique needs, and experiences. Psychologists label our view of ourselves the self-concept. It includes what we know about our interests, attitudes, beliefs, experiences, and lifestyle. The self-concept is an important determinant of our buying behavior. Consider the likely differences in the self-concepts of people who drive pickup trucks versus hybrids, or who collect works of art versus guns. Ads must help consumers remember information from ads for later use. Memory, according to psychologists, is divided into short-term memory, which is a temporary repository for things a person is thinking about at a given moment, and long-term memory, a seemingly limitless storage area for what we have learned or know. Repetition in short-term memory helps people store information in long-term memory. As a result, ads often repeat key pieces of information several times. Information in long-term memory is not stored randomly, but rather in mental files. To cope with the complexity of stimuli such as advertising, we rank products and other data in our files by importance, price, quality, features, or a host of other descriptors. By definition, learning is a relatively permanent change in thought process or behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Information that is learned is successfully transferred to long-term memory, where it is available for later use. Learning, in turn, affects behavior. Learning that a food tastes delicious leads to eating more. Learning that a hot stove burns leads to keeping a distance from a range top in the kitchen. There are numerous theories of learning, but advertisers classify many into two broad categories: cognitive theory and conditioning theory, depending on the level of consumer involvement, high or low, required to make a purchase. Cognitive theory views learning as a mental process of memory, thinking, and the rational application of knowledge to dealing with practical problems. This theory may be an accurate description of how we learn from the experience of others and how we evaluate a complex purchase such as insurance, stocks and bonds, or business products. It is deliberate and thoughtful. Conversely, conditioning theory, also called stimulus response theory, treats learning as a trial and error process. Some stimulus, perhaps an ad, triggers the consumer's need or want, and this in turn creates the drive to respond. If the consumer's response reduces the drive, then satisfaction occurs, and that produces repeat behavior the next time the drive is aroused, demonstrating that learning has taken place. What determines which type of process, conditioning or cognitive, consumers are likely to use when learning information? Consumer involvement appears to play an important role. Involvement refers to how personally important or relevant a decision is to a consumer. More important and relevant decisions result in greater involvement. Conditioning theory is more applicable to the simple, basic, low-involvement purchases consumers make every day, such as soap, cereal, toothpaste, and paper towels. It is here that reinforcement advertising plays its most important role, along with superior product performance and good service. If learning is reinforced enough and repeat behavior is produced, a purchasing habit may result. Cognitive theories seem most applicable in highly involving situations, as when a consumer buys a car or an expensive TV. In these situations, people search for information from memory, carefully consider new evidence, and often resist the strong urges of emotion. Learning and persuasion are closely linked. Persuasion occurs when the change in belief, attitude, or behavioral intention is caused by a message, such as advertising or personal selling. Naturally, advertisers are very interested in persuasion and how it takes place. Just as there are two different ways learning can occur, through a relatively thoughtful way, cognition, or a relatively simple way, conditioning, there seem to be two different paths to persuasion. Psychologists label these different routes to persuasion the central and peripheral route. As with learning theory, the route to persuasion depends on a consumer's level of involvement with the product and message. When a consumer's level of involvement is higher, the central route to persuasion is more likely. On the other hand, the peripheral route to persuasion predominates when consumer involvement is low. We can see how this works by looking at the elaboration likelihood model. In the central route to persuasion, consumers with higher levels of involvement with the product or the message pay careful attention to product-related information, such as product attributes and benefits, or demonstrations of positive functional or psychological consequences. Persuasion is aided by strong arguments about why the consumer could benefit from the product. Consumers processing ads through this route learn cognitively and elaborate on the message. The peripheral route to persuasion is very different. It is more stimulus response learning. People who are not in the market for a product typically have low involvement with the product message.